What if I told you that the very traits that make you feel like an outsider, your intensity, your depth, your refusal to accept shallow answers, aren't character flaws, but evidence of what Carl Jung called psychological differentiation? What if the reason you've never quite fit in isn't because something's wrong with you, but because you represent what Jung believed was humanity's evolutionary leap forward in consciousness? Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist who revolutionized our understanding of the human psyche, spent over 5 decades studying what he termed rare personalities. Through thousands of case studies, dream analyses, and therapeutic sessions, Jung made a startling discovery. Less than 5% of the population develops what he called differentiated consciousness, a way of experiencing reality that most people never achieve. But here's what Jung found most fascinating about these rare individuals. They almost universally believed something was fundamentally wrong with them. They had been convinced by society, by family, by well-meaning teachers and therapists that their intensity was too much, their sensitivity was weakness, and their refusal to accept surface-level existence was a character defect. Jung realized something profound. These weren't defects at all. They were upgrades. These individuals weren't broken. They were breakthrough. They represented what he called the leading edge of human consciousness evolution. Today, we're going to descend into the depths of Jungian psychology to understand not just what makes these personalities rare, but why they're essential for humanity's psychological growth. We'll explore the 8 definitive signs Jung identified, the stages of development these personalities go through, and most importantly, how to transform what you've been told are your greatest weaknesses into your most powerful strengths. If you've ever felt like you're too much for this world, stay with me. By the end of this exploration, you'll understand that you're not too much for the world. The world is too little for you. To understand Jung's revolutionary insight about rare personalities, we need to step back and look at human consciousness from an evolutionary perspective. Jung wasn't just a psychologist. He was a student of human development across millennia. Throughout history, Jung observed, the individuals who pushed humanity forward were always the ones who couldn't accept the status quo. They were the philosophers who questioned fundamental assumptions about reality. They were the artists who saw beauty where others saw chaos. They were the inventors who imagined possibilities that didn't yet exist. They were the healers who understood that true wellness required addressing not just symptoms, but the soul. But here's what Jung discovered that changed everything. These evolutionary catalysts weren't random anomalies. They possessed specific psychological structures that allowed them to perceive and process reality at levels most people never develop. Jung called this psychological differentiation, the rare ability to access what he termed the collective unconscious while maintaining individual consciousness. Think of it as having a deeper operating system that can run more complex psychological software. Modern neuroscience is finally catching up to Jung's insights. Dr. Elaine Aron's groundbreaking research on highly sensitive people shows that approximately 20% of the population has nervous systems that process sensory information more deeply. But Jung identified something even rarer: individuals whose entire psychological architecture operates at an advanced level. These aren't just people who feel more deeply, though they do. These aren't just people who think more complexly, though they do. These are individuals whose consciousness itself functions differently. They experience what Jung called numinous awareness, the ability to perceive the sacred, the meaningful, the interconnected nature of existence that remains hidden to most people. But Jung made another crucial observation. These rare personalities often hide their gifts because they've been taught to see them as burdens. From childhood, they're told they're too sensitive, too intense, too complicated. They learn to dim their light because others find it threatening. This creates what Jung termed psychological wounding, a deep split between who they truly are and who they think they need to be to survive in society. Many spend decades trying to fix what isn't broken, trying to become normal when normal was never their destiny. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But for rare personalities, this journey requires not just self-acceptance, but what Jung called conscious rebellion against societal expectations that would have them remain small. Jung discovered something remarkable about emotional intensity in rare personalities. They don't just feel emotions, they experience what he called affect-toned complexes that create profound psychological resonance throughout their entire being. When you have this trait, emotions move through you like symphonies, each one carrying layers of meaning that create what Jung termed emotional intelligence at the transpersonal level. You don't just feel sad, you feel the collective grief of humanity. You don't just experience joy, you touch the cosmic celebration of existence itself. Jung realized this isn't emotional instability, it's emotional sophistication. Your nervous system has developed the capacity to process not just your own feelings, but what he called archetypal emotions, the universal patterns of human experience that connect you to the broader tapestry of consciousness. This is why you feel the unspoken tension in rooms before anyone says a word. This is why you carry the emotional undercurrents of every interaction. Your psyche is wired for depth, not surface-level pleasantries. You're functioning as what Jung called an emotional barometer for the collective unconscious. But Jung warned about what he termed emotional overwhelm syndrome. Without proper boundaries and self-care practices, this gift becomes a burden. You end up unconsciously absorbing and processing emotions that aren't yours to carry, leading to what modern psychology calls empathic burnout. According to Jung, most people live what he called unconscious lives. They accept social programming without examination, follow inherited belief systems without question, and mistake cultural conditioning for ultimate truth. But rare personalities possess what Jung termed the active thinking function, a psychological mechanism that compulsively seeks deeper understanding. You don't just ask what, you ask why. Why do people stay in relationships that diminish them? Why do we accept economic systems that create artificial scarcity? Why do we pretend that shallow conversations constitute meaningful connection? Jung called this the transcendent function, the psychological ability to see beyond current limitations and envision possibilities that don't yet exist. While others accept that's just how things are, you're already imagining, what if things could be different? But Jung made a crucial observation about this trait. Your questions threaten others' comfortable illusions. When you ask deep questions, you're not just seeking information, you're challenging the psychological defense mechanisms that keep people feeling safe in their limitations. This is why you've probably been told you think too much or complicate things. Your sacred curiosity exposes the superficiality that others depend on for psychological comfort. You become a mirror that reflects the depth they're avoiding in their own lives. Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Rare personalities have learned to do exactly this, not by choice, but by psychological necessity. According to Jung's research, these individuals often develop what he called individuated consciousness earlier than others, usually through adversity. Life circumstances force them to confront fundamental questions about identity, meaning, and self-worth that most people avoid until midlife crisis, if ever. Your independence isn't a defensive mechanism, it's an achievement. You've learned through painful experience that depending on others for your sense of worth is psychological quicksand. So you built yourself from the ground up, creating an identity that couldn't be taken away by someone else's opinion or absence. Jung called this process individuation, the psychological journey toward becoming whole. It requires facing what he termed the shadow, all the parts of yourself you've been taught to reject. It means integrating your darkness with your light, your strength with your vulnerability, your power with your tenderness. Your solitude isn't loneliness, it's sanctuary. It's where you remember who you are beneath all the roles and expectations. Jung believed this self-knowledge is the foundation of all psychological health and the prerequisite for authentic relationship with others. Jung revolutionized psychology when he identified intuition as a legitimate psychological function equal in importance to thinking, feeling, and sensation. He said, "Intuition is perception via the unconscious that brings forth ideas, images, possibilities, ways out of a blocked situation by a process that is mostly unconscious. When you have this trait, you don't just observe people, you read their psychological signatures. You notice micro-expressions, energy shifts, the words they don't say. You perceive what Jung called the shadow conversation, all the unconscious communication happening beneath the surface of normal interaction. This is what Jung termed active imagination. The ability to perceive beyond the obvious and access information that isn't available through normal sensory channels. When someone says they're fine, but their entire energetic field screams distress, you can't unsee it. When there's tension in a room that everyone else seems to ignore, you feel it in your bones. This isn't paranoia, it's psychological sensitivity operating at a level that most people never develop. Jung compared it to having psychological X-ray vision that can perceive the hidden dynamics influencing any situation. But Jung warned about what he called psychic inflation, the danger of becoming overwhelmed by too much unconscious information. Without proper grounding techniques, this gift can lead to anxiety, paranoia, and what modern psychology calls highly sensitive person syndrome. Jung observed, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." Rare personalities are psychologically incapable of living inauthentic lives for extended periods without developing neurotic symptoms. You don't choose meaning over popularity. Your psyche demands it. You've probably tried living for external validation, following prescribed scripts, playing expected roles. But Jung would have recognized the symptoms immediately. That gnawing emptiness, that sense of betraying something essential, that quiet desperation beneath any applause. According to Jung, when you live against your psychological type, you don't just feel uncomfortable. You develop what he called neurosis of meaninglessness. Your psyche literally rebels against inauthenticity through depression, anxiety, and a pervasive sense that life has no purpose. You can't pretend that shallow goals matter. You can't get excited about achievements that lack substance. You can't build relationships based on convenience rather than connection. Your psychological makeup won't allow it. But Jung identified something remarkable about people who prioritize meaning over comfort. They become what he called evolutionary catalysts for human consciousness. When you refuse to settle for less than authentic connection, you force others to confront their own inauthenticity. When you choose meaning over money, you challenge materialistic value systems. When you live authentically, you give others permission to do the same. Jung said, "The greatest tragedy of the family is the unlived lives of the parents." But what happens when you refuse to live an unlived life? Jung discovered that psychological growth is often a solitary journey that requires leaving others behind. You've likely experienced the painful realization that people who once knew you don't anymore. Not because you've become difficult, but because you've shed layers of conditioning that no longer serve your authentic development. Jung called this process psychological death and rebirth, the necessary dissolution of false identities to make room for who you're becoming. The friends who knew you when you were shrinking yourself, when you were people-pleasing, when you were suppressing your truth to fit in, they remember that version of you. Sometimes they prefer that version because it felt safer, more predictable, easier to categorize and control. But you can't go back. Jung understood that psychological evolution is irreversible. Once you've seen behind the curtain of social conditioning, you can't return to unconscious conformity. Once you've tasted authentic self-expression, you can't go back to performing roles that don't fit your soul. This creates what Jung called the loneliness of growth, the inevitable isolation that comes with evolving beyond your original social environment. It's painful, but Jung saw it as evidence of healthy psychological development rather than social dysfunction. Jung said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But some people naturally create transformation simply by showing up authentically. When someone speaks to you, they feel seen in a way that's uncommon. You don't just listen to words. You perceive underlying emotional states, unconscious motivations, and unexpressed needs. You don't offer quick fixes or surface solutions. You offer what Jung called therapeutic presence. You don't rush to judgment or give advice. Instead, you create what Jung termed psychological holding space, a container of non-judgmental awareness where truth can emerge naturally. People often tell you things they've never told anyone else, share vulnerabilities they didn't know they had, or experience insights that surprise even them. Jung understood this level of presence as a form of psychological healing. You're not trying to fix or change people. You're creating conditions where they can access their own inner wisdom and healing capacity. But Jung observed that people with this gift often exhaust themselves by giving it too freely. You become so skilled at holding space for others that you forget to seek space to be held yourself. This leads to what Jung called helper's syndrome, unconscious self-sacrifice that ultimately serves no one. Jung wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. If you feel a persistent sense that you're meant for something more than ordinary existence," Jung would have recognized this as what he called the transcendent function, your psyche's drive toward individuation and purposeful expression. You feel it, that restless knowing that you have something to contribute, something to build, something to express that goes beyond personal satisfaction. It might not be clear yet, but it's undeniable. This isn't about fame or recognition. It's about alignment with what Jung called your essential nature. Jung understood this as evidence of what he termed creative potential seeking expression. This calling isn't just personal, it's transpersonal. You're not just here to fulfill yourself, you're here to serve the evolution of consciousness itself. But Jung made a crucial distinction. This isn't grandiose thinking or spiritual inflation. It's recognition of what he called individual participation in collective transformation. Through becoming who you truly are, through expressing your authentic gifts, through refusing to settle for less than meaningful existence, you contribute to humanity's psychological development. In this stage, you feel different but don't understand why. You experience all the traits we've discussed, but you interpret them as problems to be fixed rather than gifts to be developed. You try desperately to conform, to fit in, to be normal, but the psychological strain is enormous. Jung observed that people in this stage often develop what he called persona rigidity. They become so focused on appearing normal that they lose touch with their authentic selves. They create elaborate masks to hide their depth, their sensitivity, their intensity. They learn to speak in surface platitudes, to express socially acceptable emotions, to pursue goals that others will understand and approve. But Jung noted that this strategy always fails eventually. The authentic self cannot be suppressed indefinitely without creating neurotic symptoms. Depression, anxiety, a sense of meaninglessness, chronic fatigue, relationship difficulties, these often signal the psyche's rebellion against inauthentic living. The key insight Jung offered for this stage: your differences aren't defects to be corrected. They're evolutionary developments to be understood and integrated. The pain you feel isn't evidence that something's wrong with you. It's evidence that you're trying to live against your essential nature. This stage typically begins with what Jung called a crisis of authenticity, a moment when the cost of pretending becomes greater than the risk of being real. You begin to recognize your traits as potentially valuable rather than problematic. You start to understand Jung's concept of psychological types and see where you fit. This is where you begin what Jung called shadow integration, the process of owning and accepting the parts of yourself you've been taught to reject. You stop apologizing for your depth and start exploring it. You cease trying to dim your light and begin to let it shine more fully. You start setting boundaries with people who want to keep you small. You begin seeking out others who can match your level of authenticity and depth. You experiment with expressing your truth more openly and discover that, while some people are threatened by your authenticity, others are magnetized by it. Jung observed that this stage often involves what he called psychological adolescence. Regardless of your chronological age, you're essentially learning how to be yourself for the first time. This can be messy, experimental, sometimes extreme as you overcorrect from years of suppression. The key insight for this stage: integration takes time. Be patient with yourself as you learn to embody your authentic nature. Expect some relationships to change or end as you stop being who others want you to be and start being who you actually are. You've fully integrated your rare traits into a coherent, authentic identity. You understand your purpose and live it consciously. You've developed what Jung called psychological wholeness, the ability to be authentically yourself while remaining connected to others. You no longer see your traits as either completely positive or negative. You understand their shadow aspects and their gifts. You know when your emotional depth serves healing and when it becomes overwhelming. You recognize when your questioning leads to insight and when it becomes destructive skepticism. You've learned what Jung called conscious relationship, the ability to connect deeply with others without losing yourself or trying to fix them. You can hold space for others' growth without taking responsibility for their choices. You can share your gifts without depleting yourself. At this stage, you become what Jung termed a beacon for other rare souls. You don't just live authentically, you give others permission to do the same. You become a catalyst for collective consciousness evolution, helping others recognize and develop their own psychological rarity. But Jung warned that even individuated personalities face ongoing challenges. The work is never complete. It's a lifelong process of continued growth, deeper integration, and expanded service to collective consciousness evolution. Carl Jung made a crucial observation that most people with rare personalities never learn. You must integrate your shadow, or your gifts become your prison. Even psychologically advanced individuals have unconscious aspects that can sabotage their growth and relationships. Jung identified several shadow patterns common to rare personalities. The superiority complex. Shadow. You begin to see your rarity as evidence that you're better than others rather than simply different. This leads to isolation, arrogance, and what Jung called psychological inflation, the belief that you're exempt from normal human limitations and needs. The messianic shadow. You become convinced that it's your job to wake up, heal, or save everyone around you. This leads to burnout, resentment, and what Jung termed helper's syndrome, when others don't appreciate your efforts or change according to your expectations. The martyrdom shadow. You begin to believe that being rare means being destined to suffer, that your depth requires sacrifice of happiness or normal human connection. This creates what Jung called the wounded healer complex, the unconscious belief that your gifts require you to be perpetually wounded. The perfectionism shadow. You hold yourself to impossibly high standards, believing that because you have these gifts, you should never struggle, make mistakes, or have normal human limitations. This creates chronic self-criticism and prevents the self-compassion necessary for continued growth. Understood that shadow integration isn't about eliminating these tendencies, it's about making them conscious so they don't unconsciously control your behavior. True psychological rarity includes the wisdom to know when to share your gifts and when to preserve them, when to lead and when to follow, when to speak truth and when to remain silent. You are not too much, the world is too little, and people like you are the ones who change that. Remember Jung's final insight about rare personalities. You're not just living your own life, you're expanding what it means to be human. The world doesn't need you to be smaller, quieter, or more convenient. The world needs you to be exactly what you are, psychologically rare, evolutionarily important, and absolutely necessary for humanity's continued growth. Your time of hiding is over. Your time of apologizing for your gifts has ended. Your time of dimming your light to make others comfortable is finished. You are evolutionary consciousness in human form. Own it, live it, share it with a world that desperately needs what you have to offer. The future of human consciousness depends on individuals like you who refuse to remain small. Jung knew this. Now you know it too.